Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. Lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. Well, we're having some real topical stuff on live streams, aren't we? Well, first off, let's work on a local issue in South Africa. Please get a pen and paper ready, because you're going to take down some information if you live in the southern coast area of KwaZulu-Natal. I have some contact details you might like to follow up on, and I'll tell you why. For those who live on the south coast of KwaZulu-Natal and have had no water for 7 days, this will be of great interest to you. Okay, that's the Ugu Mayor, Phumlile Mitiani. They're his contact details. Phone him. Harass him. Let him know that you're not happy, Jan. Okay, so there's Phumlile Mitiani, the Ugu Mayor. And what about the municipal manager? Well, I've got those details as well. There you go. Dr. Michael Ntombela, acting municipal manager of Ugu. So guys, there are the contact details. I hope you're writing them down, and I hope you're going to give them heaps. Because, hey, if I hadn't had water for 7 months, I would be absolutely pissed off, believe me. All right, now let's get back to the subject at hand, shall we? We're talking about Ukraine. And we're talking about a situation that is completely out of control. And if you look at how the mainstream media are presenting it, you would think that it's all the fault of Russia, wouldn't you? Well, I've got some videos here which might give a slightly different perspective, and we're actually going to be discussing that tonight. But let me play these little video clips so you get an idea of exactly what is happening in Ukraine. Here we go.
So I had a recommendation to cover Ukraine. I thought this was a great idea. I figured I could just briefly analyze the situation and report. However, after extensive research that lasted the entire day and night and nearly led me into an existential crisis, I think I'm ready. Now, if you've been following what the mainstream media and the White House has been saying about this, basically they say that Russia wants to invade Ukraine. Now, in a press conference, the White House said that Russia was going to start false flags so they would have an excuse to attack Ukraine. Now, false flags was a conspiracy theory, but that's for another video. Now, even if Russia did do this, well, why are we getting involved? You know, you have to start questioning things when our government cares more about what's going on the eastern border of Ukraine than they do our own borders. This should be between Russia and Ukraine. Yes, if NATO got involved, then by treaty we would have to defend Ukraine. But now we get to the truth. What's really going on there, because Russia says that they don't actually want to attack Ukraine. The issue going on in Ukraine isn't new at all. Those who have planned to hijack the United States of America, and who now successfully have used Ukraine for a long time to launder money. A lot of corruption has happened there, like running a coup to take over the Ukrainian government, and the country is currently suffering. Now, I'm not going to list everyone and all the organizations involved, but just naming a few I think is important. So the Obamas, the Clintons, Biden, Soros, Pelosi, etc. They have been sending massive amounts of money to Ukraine, including millions and millions of dollars worth of weapons. Why would they do this? Because it's on the border of Russia and they wanted to go to war with Russia. I believe they planned to do this under Hillary Clinton, however she was not elected, and it really messed up their plan. You know what's really interesting about all of this? Putin is against the New World Order. Russiagate happened during all of this to make us think that Russia was the bad guy. Trump knew what was going on and tried to stop it. He tried to stop $400 million worth of weapons from being sent there, and he got impeached for it. And now that he's out of the way, they're back to their plan. And by the way, if Ukraine gets wiped out, well, so does the evidence of their corruption. I hate to break it to you, but Russia does not want to go to war. A very small and corrupt group that hijacked this country wants to go to war. These people will make a lot of money during war. They don't really care about the millions that will die as long as they're getting their paychecks. And rather than obviously telling us what's really going on, they're going to blame Russia and say it's Russia that's doing the false flags. And why haven't you heard about any of this? Oh yeah, that's right, because Soros funds all of our media. Now, it all makes sense to me. They've been so cocky with everything that's happened in the past few years, and it's because they didn't care if they got caught or not, because they knew we would be in World War III. Now I really hope this doesn't happen, and if it does, you know the truth now.
Okay, let's listen to a little bit more.
You're not going to hear on the mainstream media. What you do hear is warmongers arguing that we must protect Ukraine because it is a quote-unquote democracy. But they're lying. Ukraine isn't actually a democracy. For example, to hold on to power, Ukraine's president shut down the 3 TV stations that were openly criticizing him and his policies, imprisoned the head of the opposition political party that had come in second place in their elections, and went and arrested and jailed that party's leaders. This is exactly what Putin has been accused of doing. But Ukraine did this all with the support of the United States.
All right, now finally, just a short little clip which kind of summarizes what is actually going on.
Who you trying to mess with, Ese? Don't you know who my daddy is?
That Hunter Biden was trading on his father's office to make $50,000 a month from the Ukrainians. In October, he admitted it.
The fact that you were the son of the vice president.
Yeah, no.
What role do you think that played?
I think that it is impossible for me to be on any of the boards that I just mentioned without saying that I'm the son of the Vice President of the United States.
Son of Joe Biden, and boy, it's tough. I put the crack in the pipe and smoke it up. I like every day I'm tweaking, laptop leaking, pictures of me on a cocaine bender. Quick Pro Joe got me working in the Ukraine gas company directing. The only thing I know about gas, you can huff it. Now I got $50,000 a month in my pocket. For the directors, charisma, I'm smashing. My dead brother's widow, impregnate a stripper. But nothing is better than crack cocaine when you're rich and famous in the Ukraine. Cocaine in the Ukraine. Cocaine in Ukraine. Cocaine in the Ukraine. Cocaine straight to the brain. Cocaine in the Ukraine. Cocaine in Ukraine. Cocaine in the Ukraine. Cocaine straight to the brain.
Okay guys, now that kind of gives you a bit of an intro as to an alternative perspective. And just for the record, have a look at this. Not bad, is it? All on the board of directors for energy companies doing business in Ukraine. I think you might recognize some of those names. Okay. All right, let's get our guest on. Yusuf Ismail, who's been a regular on Loving Life TV. And here we go. I'll get Yusuf on. Hi, Yusuf.
Hello, good evening.
How are you, buddy?
How are you? How are you doing?
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Now, we've got a real hot topic tonight, all about Ukraine. I've actually played a couple of short video clips where you can see the children of the famous or the politically connected in the US and their connections with companies in Ukraine and all the other sorts of going-ons, which obviously you know all about. So,
Yeah.
let's get straight into the subject. Actually, before we do, just something local. What's going on
Yeah.
in Ugu?
Well, you know what? A lot is going on, not just in Ugu, but in South Africa. As I talk now, my cousin was shot in the arm in Sandton municipality just yesterday at a restaurant. I believe it was Sandton. I mean, your chances of getting killed in South Africa and the violence in South Africa is far more higher than being killed by a Russian missile targeting Ukraine. I can tell you that. Speaking about the local municipality here in Ugu, the Ugu district municipality, which in fact covers the area from Scottsboro all the way to Port Edward, or around about there. What has been happening is that our communities have not had water for weeks on end. And I mean, this has been ongoing. I think I mentioned this to you last year, the previous year, 2020. This has been going on. I mean, right now we're in an area where the water situation is so bad that the entire road, I'm living closer to the beach, the entire road, the area surrounding the Wonga area has got absolutely no water. And the reason for that is that the main pipes have been broken by the municipal workers. And what they've done now is that they've covered the road up. They've actually retarred the road without any pipes. So the reality that I was given two numbers. I contacted our ward councillor. He gave me two numbers. One is the municipal, the Ugu mayor. And if your viewers want to call her, they can call her. Her name is Phumlile Mtiane, an ANC member, Phumlile Mtiane. Her number is 071-913-2697, 071-913-2697. The other individual is a municipal manager of Ugu municipality, Dr. Michael Mtombela, and his number is 082-907-6993, 082-907-6993. These individuals need to be shamed. Ugu district municipality and the Ray and Konyeni municipalities, arguably one of the most corrupt municipalities in South Africa, with amounts close to $1 billion having been stolen. So phone them, 082-907-6993, 076-322-6146, and confront them in terms of what is going on. Right now, we have no water. I have to source water in terms of doing daily facilities like bathing and showering and even making, there's no water. There's absolutely no water in the areas. And this is an ongoing problem, which the communities have to stand up and do something about it. And so that's a situation there that we have now in this particular country. And I make the point that you've got a higher chance of being gunned down in South Africa than you have of actually having a missile killing you in Ukraine at this particular point in time. And that just goes to show the gravity of the situation and the violence that we are in fact enveloped in South Africa at this juncture, contrary to what the media would like to portray out there.
Right. Okay, now you've had your bit of rant against Ugu, and I actually put up the images with all the contact details for those two people. I'm sure they're going to have lots of phone calls and lots of emails. Well, it's about damn time, because these guys are just sitting on their hands. Now, let's get back to the subject for tonight's live stream. Let's get to the bare bones of this. What is the background of conflict in Ukraine?
Well, the armed conflict in Ukraine as you see the trajectory of what is transpiring now, actually erupted around about early 2014. But even before that, I think in 2013 or 2012, when Putin was going to be elected as the re-election as a leader of Russia, and at that particular juncture, there were massive protests that were happening against him, and he made it quite clear that he wanted to have some degree of dealing with the future and the trajectory of Ukraine, and in fact where Ukraine is heading. But what subsequently happened is that in 2014 there were a series of conflicts that were basically taking place. Let me put it in proper context. Ukraine had a leader by the name of Viktor Yanukovych. All of you take note of that, and you can check him up online who he is. Viktor Yanukovych was someone that was very closely aligned to Russia. He was viewed as a strong ally of Russia. And, not surprisingly, what had happened subsequently is that this was now not viewed as pragmatic to the United States, because you had NATO, you had the European Union, and of course you had a large oil reserves in that specific region, and you had an individual now who was closely aligned with Russia. Now you then see, strangely enough, something which is called, and I want your viewers to take note of this, the Euromaidan demonstrations. This was viewed as the that's the kind of Romanized form, the Ukrainian form, Euromaidan. It was a wave of demonstrations. It was a civil unrest in Ukraine, which began in November, the end of November 2013, and there were public protests in Kiev. And the protests were actually apparently sparked, and I'm saying they were created, they were instigated, in my opinion, by NATO and by the Obama administration. And they were sparked primarily because of the Ukrainian government's decision under Viktor Yanukovych in suspending the signing of the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement. You see, there was apparently some sort of agreement which would kind of link up the Ukraine to the European Union, but Ukraine and its leadership, on the other hand, chose closer ties to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union as opposed to the European Union. So that's obviously going to be a conflict. If you are now with Eastern Europe and the Eurasian Economic Union as opposed to the European Union, of course there's going to be an economic conflict and of course a challenge to the existing European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement. So then there were these protests, which is quite odd because, I mean, why would the protesters, in fact, want Ukraine to be part and parcel of this agreement and association with the European Union? If you looked at the rest of Europe, Western Europe in particular, I mean, there were moves like in the United Kingdom to get out of the European Union. There were moves and protests even in many countries like Germany and Italy to not be part and parcel of the European Union, and the individuals wanting to retain their own currency and independence. But strangely enough, here you had a situation where protesters were apparently forcing and calling upon this agreement to happen. And that's why I'm saying that the scope of the protest widened, and there were calls for the resignation of the president of Ukraine, that's the chap Viktor Yanukovych, and they were basically initiated on the basis of allegedly widespread government corruption, abuse of power, and the key word, violation of human rights in Ukraine, which is quite odd because when you look at who replaced him, those that replaced him were in fact neo-Nazis. I mean, there were neo-Nazis that were eventually, part and parcel, and we'll discuss this group as we go on. There is this particular neo-Nazi paramilitary group which is called the what's it called, the Askarov Battalion.
Is it AVO?
As being the Azov Battalion. Azov Battalion. It's a right-wing extremist. It's a neo-Nazi unit. They view Hitler as one of the heroes, and it obviously was involved in as being anti-Russian, and they in fact form the basis of the military and the armed forces in Ukraine when this new chap came into power. This character called Viktor Zelensky, that essentially came into power. So what happened is that the protests then led to the 2014 Ukrainian coup, which is known in the West. And the West again puts the name Revolution of Dignity, that essentially overthrew the government. In reality, it was a deliberate overthrow. It was a coup that was basically administered by the United States government and, of course, by NATO. NATO got rid of this. I mean, fairly. They were purportedly democratic. There was nothing to suggest that Viktor Yanukovych was. I'm not saying he was a saint of any sort, but I mean there was nothing untoward and nothing that was essentially violent in terms of the administration. His only crime, his only sin, was that he appeared to be closely allied to Russia. So in December of that year, in I think 2013, the crowd, they toppled the Lenin the statue that was nearby. They occupied government buildings, and there was fierce fighting in Kiev. And what then happened is that this led to representatives from the Russian government and, of course, other high government officials to come and basically sign an agreement. Or come together and recognize an agreement that had basically been called upon by Russia. And that was, in fact, something which was called the Minsk Agreement.
Right.
Now, the Minsk... Yes, go ahead, Scott.
No, that's fine.
Yeah,
I thought you
were going to say something. The Minsk Agreement, what the Minsk, M-I-N-S-K, Minsk Agreement, there were a set of international agreements which were basically calling upon to end the war in the Donbass. The Donbass is that particular area in Ukraine, which I believe Russia has now, kind of called for its annexation, wanting it to be incorporated into the Russian Federation. But
that's right on the east side of Ukraine. Right,
that is correct.
Russia. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's that area there. It's Luhansk. It's right on that side there. Donetsk as well. And what this basically did was drafted in 2014 by the Trilateral Contract Group on Ukraine. That consisted of Ukraine. It consisted of Russia, and a group called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And what this basic agreement did was that it was supposed to stop fighting, but it failed to stop fighting. And so there was a revised agreement that was done sometime in 2015. And that agreement essentially in 2015 comprised of a series of measures. One was ceasefire. There was a withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front line, release of prisoners. There was going to be a reform in Ukraine. That means Ukraine would be allowed would be granted some degree of self-government to certain areas of Donbass. And in fact, essentially, what had happened is that whilst the fighting subsided following the agreement signing, it never ended completely. And so the provisions of the Minsk Protocol was never fulfilled. And I think probably one of the prime architects in ensuring that it never got fulfilled was the United States government under the Barack Obama administration, and certainly NATO, that wanted at some level Ukraine to be basically integrated into NATO, because Ukraine is a neighbor with Russia. The next neighbor of Ukraine is Hungary. If Ukraine is now incorporated in the European Union, what then happens is NATO forces have got free access to that particular region, and they're essentially on the border of Russia. I mean, the equivalent would be that suddenly you've got the Chinese military. Let's take it for an example. The Chinese military suddenly go and are allowed by Mexico to be on the borders of the United States. So on the borders of the United States, Chinese military forces are there. They are now on the borders of New Mexico. They are now on the borders, meaning if you cross the border, you enter Arizona, and the borders nearby Texas. What would the United States government do in a situation of that nature if there were Chinese military that were there? I can tell you what the US government would do. They would probably blow them into oblivion or see them as a major threat. So essentially what happened, and I'm not a fan of Russia.
Yes,
I don't support Belarus. Yes, go ahead, Scotty. Were you saying something?
Yeah. Look what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean,
yeah,
that's an
exactly. That's a classic example that you've got. So what essentially happened now is that this government of Viktor Yanukovych was deposed. You then had a government of this character, Viktor Zelensky. And Zelensky's by the way, Viktor Zelensky, do you know what his background is? Do the people know what his background, this guy's background? He's got no political background. He's not a lawyer. I'm not saying lawyers are any good, but he's not someone that comes from a political background. He was a stand-up comedian.
Yeah, that's
Can you
right.
believe it? This guy was a stand-up comedian, Viktor Zelensky. So he came into power, and then he incorporated these neo-Nazi fascist organizations. I mean, Eastern Europe has always been a kind of a magnet to fascism and to fascist neo-Nazi organizations. Why they exist in Russia, but why they have been clamped down in Russia is that Russia has always been traditionally communist. I mean, prior to obviously the Soviet Union, but they've got that communist archetype, that background. And so essentially communism and fascism, although they two extremes, one far right, the other being far left, they don't get on eye to eye, although they are both oppressive systems. And so fascism hasn't had a stronghold in Russia, but it has had a stronghold in Ukraine. And so this character came on board. He's now very pro United States. And so essentially there were tensions that were then arising in Russia, arising in Ukraine. And what Russia did is that apparently they officially, the equivalent would be to South Africa now tomorrow, officially recognizing Lesotho and officially recognizing Swaziland as being part and parcel of South Africa, which, by the way, I would support, but for different reasons. But what Russia did is that they officially recognized Luhansk and the Donetsk People's Republic on the 21st of February, which was...
Yusuf, if we can just go back on a couple of points here, and I think these are really, really important. And the first one is that after the breakup of Russia, and Ukraine used to be part of the USSR.
Yes.
Now, after that breakup, an agreement was signed where NATO agreed not to go into bordering Balkan territories. And it's done that. It's actually gone into 3 countries which are basically bordering Russia against the terms of this agreement. So NATO is actually in breach of an agreement with Russia. Do you want to tell us about that? Because that's pretty pivotal to what's happening right now.
Yeah, look, and this is the whole point, because to understand the history of the Ukraine crisis and the role of the neo-Nazi mobs like Azov Battalion, and there are many others not as prominent as them, you have to understand the fact that this has been supported by the US-NATO alliance. What is happening in Ukraine has got basically international and serious geopolitical implications. The reality of the situation is as follows. Ukraine was obviously part and parcel of the USSR. This was something that was has always been, part of the USSR, and of course, it essentially broke away after the collapse of the Soviet Union. NATO, on the other hand, which is, as you correctly pointed out, I think, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it's essentially an intergovernmental military alliance that exists between, I think, approximately about 25 or to 30 European countries, and of course there are two North American countries primarily, which is the United States. And what NATO does, in fact, constitute, it's a system of collective security whereby independent member states who are part and parcel of this body called NATO, they agree to mutually defending themselves in response to an attack by any external party. Now, NATO is headquartered in Belgium, whilst that's located in Brussels. And since its admission, there have been many new member states that have been added to the original alliance. I think the number of countries subject to correction is about 30. The most recent addition has been Macedonia, North Macedonia. This was in 2020 at the time of lockdown. And at this juncture, it recognizes Bosnia, Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine was viewed as an aspiring member. But Ukraine became an aspiring member, and the shift towards joining this intergovernmental military alliance, which is called NATO, only happened after the coup, which led to the doing away and getting rid of Viktor Yanukovych. So when Zelensky, a compliant leader, came on board, they basically started aiming and moving for this whole idea, essentially of joining NATO. Now the problem is that historically speaking, when there was this movie you probably know called Dunkirk. I think it's done by Christopher Nolan, the same director who made the movie the Dark Knight trilogy, the Batman series. But if you look at the Treaty of Dunkirk, which was a kind of a prelude to the formation of NATO, what had happened was that there was a treaty of alliance, a mutual assistance between France and the United Kingdom. They signed this treaty in the event, and this is in 1947, of a possible attack by Germany or the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War II, because World War II had ended, and now France and the United Kingdom wanted to enter into an agreement and essentially to ensure that the Soviet Union doesn't attack. And subsequently, the following year, this alliance was expanded to include other countries in the form of, back then, the Western Union, not the European Union. And this was discussed and came into fruition at the Treaty of Brussels. And then after that, there was talks of a new military alliance, which could also include North America. And that was resulting in this signing of the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949 by member states such as the United States, Canada, Portugal, US, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Iceland.
Now,
and so this...
What I'd like to do is to share a screen with you, because I think this is really, really important that we look at this, Yusuf, because I've got a map of Europe. And what I want to do is I want to share this map with you, because what it actually...
Okay, I can't see it on my screen, but I'll probably see it on the...
I'm going to start sharing it with you now. There it is. You got it?
All right. Yeah, it seems to be blank on my screen, but I think, now I can see it now. It's quite clear. I can see it now,
it's these three countries up here, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that just recently joined NATO. And you can see they're sitting on the edge of Russia. And Russia's not very happy about that. Now, if Ukraine joins NATO, look at that exposure Russia's got to basically a hostile force. NATO, this suggestion by Ukraine that they're going to perhaps join NATO really was the catalyst for Russia to move in and say, not on our watch. Do you want to just tell us about what happened up here, Yusuf?
Yeah, I just want to check up something else, which would probably confirm my suspicions. Um, NATO alarmed by is Belarus? I'm not so sure. I think Belarus, Ukraine. Yeah, Belarus apparently Belarus isn't a member of NATO.
No, no, Belarus is actually very pro-Russian. In fact, the Russian
Yeah,
forces are sitting in
it's not a member
Belarus.
of NATO.
Yeah,
It's basically Ukraine and those other countries that you basically mentioned
yeah.
as being part and parcel of NATO. And essentially, what it amounts to is that um, NATO forces, um, the Ukrainian army, and security agencies, together with this neo-Nazi, fascist paramilitia outfits, will form one massive alliance, and they would be then operating on the border. They would be set loose in eastern Ukraine, the Odessa region. They would be basically on part and parcel of the on the border of Russia. Now, if you look, for example, in 2014. In 2014, you had a strange situation. Is that following the coup that happened, Ukraine's military forces, Ukraine's army, there was a recruitment of people that were taking place. Neo-Nazi mobs were being recruited. And what had happened was that these individuals started in coordinated attacks against individuals that were deemed as pro-Russian. And I mean, these individuals were the foot soldiers of the Western military alliance. If you look, for example, at Odessa in 2014, there were killings which, in fact, resembled the fingerprints of a U.S. NATO-led intelligence operation, with both the National Guard and there were right-wing militants trained in paramilitary combat skills, and they were involved in the killing of innocent civilians that were deemed or viewed as pro-Russian. And so, what is also quite ironical is that the Israeli media, in particular the Haaretz, which generally largely supports the Kiev regime, they've acknowledged that there's a threat of civil war that in fact can emanate from the neo-Nazi elements within the government itself, internally within Ukraine. And what then happens is when you've got the US-NATO alliance now in control of Ukraine, you've got it in control of the other country. You've got Latvia. You've got the small country of Belarus that's not a member of NATO. What then can happen is that essentially it would lead to possibly easy access into Russia, which would mean Russia, which does not want the US-NATO alliance anywhere nearby it, would then be essentially on the basis of a threat. And therefore, you've got the defense minister that has, in fact, just a few days ago, I believe on RT, and in fact, I think on France 24, there was a clip which showed him pointing out to a totally unprecedented, it's never happened, buildup of NATO forces within the proximity of Russia's borders. So that's like just across the border, a walking line. Yeah. And I mean, these can be easily accessible. And so that essentially leads to the conflict whereby Russia then decides to take the initiative and, of course, calls upon the annexation of Donetsk and the Luhansk area and so on.
Just on that point, Yusuf, the US have just put 3,500 troops into Poland, which is just spitting distance from Ukraine. And it just going back to that period when there was that coup in Ukraine, some of the very well-connected children of senior American politicians, including Biden's son, Romney's son, Pelosi's son, and Kerry's son, all became directors on the board, or got on the board of directors of energy companies doing business in Ukraine. And clearly this was, like a thank you for helping this new regime get in. And a, horribly compromised, horribly corrupt political party that took over government in 2016. Do you want to just talk about the
Yeah, no, absolutely. I
that,
think
that
as we
aspect?
talk right now, the first point is that as it is right now, there are about, I think, 5,000 military troops that have basically gathered in Poland. In fact, if you look at the number of troops, and this is basically on the basis that there may be a possible outbreak of war. In fact, I think, and I may add this. The number of troops that were sent to Poland. I mean, when was this invasion? This invasion happened on the 24th of February, right? On the 12th of February, if you spoke about Reuters, if you look at the Reuters papers, they in fact gave an indication that the United States was in the process of already sending 3,000 additional troops, and the deployment was in anticipation that Russia could be poised to invade Ukraine. And Russia then responded, stating that it was defending its own security aggression by NATO allies at that particular juncture. But already on the 12th of February, there were like 3,000 troops in Poland that were added there over and above the existing U.S. forces in the southeastern parts of Poland. And the fact is that the U.S. officials said that the troops that will be basically put there were just not ordinary troops. I mean, they were over and above the 8,000 or 9,000 American troops already there, and that are ready to be deployed to Europe if need be. So the reality is that this is in fact leading. The Biden administration is corrupt. Firstly, Joe Biden is a senile geriatric. He's at the mid stages of dementia. He's not someone that is fit to lead the actual country at this particular juncture.
Certainly not to lead the free world, that's for sure.
Absolutely, and he's now called upon American citizens to leave Ukraine. But the problem being made is that the U.S. Army is already depleted. I mean, they are now depleted in so many parts of the world. And so I'm not so sure that if, for example, let's assume tomorrow the Russian government decides to annex the entire of Ukraine, I'm not so sure that the United States government would be ready for a full-out confrontation. Or the United States does not basically attack strong nations. Let's get that clear.
Yeah.
The United States will under no circumstance want to be drawn out into a war with Russia, which could lead to an alliance that Russia would have with Iran and, of course, with China. Because in any war against the United States, if Russia were to have a war against the United States would come directly into confrontation with China. And that's the last thing that the Biden administration can afford to at this particular point in time. And so, therefore, it prefers these clandestine moves, these clandestine operations where you can have a coup in one country, you can have a compliant leadership, and then, of course, you can have your foot soldiers that are set up, backed, financially supported, and, of course, you've got the NATO presence there. But a full-out blown war, that's the last thing the United States would want at this particular juncture, because it will basically, I don't know where it will leave the United States at this particular point in time. The U.S. rather prefers to attack weak countries. When a country cannot fight back, they will totally destroy it, like Afghanistan. I mean, these guys were ragtags. The Taliban, they were trained in the arts of combat during the Afghan-Soviet war, but they were at no means on the level. It was a poverty-stricken country. Iraq was totally destroyed. Poverty-stricken country, depleted uranium. Children were dying of cancer. These were countries that had absolutely no nuclear weaponry. They had absolutely no threat to the United States government. They were not a threat to any country in the world. And so, therefore, the United States bombed them into oblivion. But a country like Russia, on the other hand, and as much as I don't and I dislike Vladimir Putin, Russia has got access to nuclear weaponry. And in fact, I saw the report in Guardian News that they would be more than willing. When he made that speech, if you listen to the speech, which was about an hour long, and I kind of briefly glimpsed through the transcript of that speech in preparing for this discussion, he spoke about the consequences if anybody interferes with Russia. And that could lead out to a full-scale nuclear war. which is highly possible, and that's the last thing the United States is more cowardly in terms of dealing with Russia, dealing with China. It's not going to get into a direct confrontation with them.
Yusuf,
so I think that's what's going to happen now.
I can tell you now that the Russians and the Chinese have got this new missile, which is hypersonic. It goes 8 times the speed of sound. And Putin boasted, he said, if we were to send off our hypersonic ICBMs into the US, they would get there from Russia into the US faster than missiles that you launched from France into Russia. That's the speed of these things. It's absolutely extraordinary. They're the killer punch.
It is extraordinary in terms of the weaponry that they have. And by the way, I must add that Vladimir Putin. I mean, he's not a foolish leader, but at the same time, he's. I just saw. I don't know if you saw the interview, the discussion that he was having with members of his cabinet, and in particular, his chief spy. I don't know if you saw that, Scott, just a few days ago. But I think I may have sent you the link. But if you look at that discussion, Putin rules with an iron fist. His people are in fear of him. I mean, members of the government. You couldn't imagine someone being in fear of Ramaphosa. I mean, or giving that level of respect to Ramaphosa for that particular matter. They treat him like a clown here in Parliament. But I just saw the level of power and the fact that he showed some degree, because what the chief spy was doing was that he was stating that at this juncture, let's look at alternatives in terms of negotiation. Let's not consider incorporating Donetsk and Luhansk into the Russian Federation as separatist regions. And Putin seemed to just basically give betray a slight aspect of displeasure. You can play that clip. I mean, it's quite amazing. So the problem is the United States does not have the capacity to engage in a full-scale war with Russia at this particular point in time. It won't happen.
Let's say the difference between Biden and Putin is that Biden is a complete jackass and Putin is ex-KGB. I'm going to play a very, very short little video clip, which to me kind of sums it up. It's actually quite amusing. Give me a second, and it lasts about 10 seconds. Here we go.
Sure.
You probably didn't see that, but everybody else did it. It's basically Putin surprising Biden, and Biden, messing up his pants.
Okay, I didn't see that. So coming back, what had happened is that at this particular juncture, what people need to know is that what Putin has done is that he's ordered troops into Luhansk, he's ordered troops into Donetsk. These are separatist regions in eastern Ukraine that are partly, as it stands now, they're controlled by Russian-backed separatists. And most of the people in the Luhansk and Donetsk region, in fact, speak Russian. They are almost Russian in many instances. And so what the United States has done now is that it's imposed sanctions on these regions, and the what's called the Nord Stream gas pipeline that has had sanctions imposed on it, I think, on the 25th or the 26th of February. And so as a result of that, the situation is basically, tense. And, I must make it clear that at this juncture, we feel for the Ukrainian people, because there are Ukrainian people that have been attacked. I saw images of a tank that crushed a vehicle. That's totally unacceptable. I mean, it's your country at the end of the day, despite the fact that you may have a fascist government. What is quite disturbing to me is that last year, in September, Ukraine's National Guard, which comprises of this Nazi fascist entity called the Azov Battalion, they had a meeting with the UK military. And the UK military started agreeing to training the forces, which are, I think included about 1,000 strong neo-Nazi unit. Now think about this. Neo-Nazism is viewed as a scourge in Western Europe, and in many instances to be part and parcel of these organizations or outfits could land you in jail. And yet at this juncture, you've got, I should have said, I think I sent you the link, Scott, which in fact showed declassified material that showed that Ukraine's National Guard were in fact being trained by the United Kingdom military. The operation was called Operation Orbital. And the UK's military, the training mission in Ukraine, you can see clearly there were pictures that were taken, and expanding to the aspect of the National Guard. This incorporated individuals that had, far-right neo-Nazi tendencies. You've got, for example, in this training that is being done by the UK military, you've got Azov fighters, and you can see these pictures. They're in eastern Ukraine, and they've already got the Nazi insignia. They've got the swastikas.
Yeah, I've seen that.
I mean, that's quite clearly there.
Yeah.
And these are being trained by the British.
Now,
the U.S. military supports Ukraine's neo-Nazi National Guard and the British government as well.
Now, Yusuf, I just want to raise a point here, and that is that when we talk about big tech, and I'm talking about Google, YouTube, Facebook, etc., they have taken sides in this whole war. For example, the Azov battalion that you talk about, their Facebook page, even though they're a clear neo-Nazi group, is up because they are fighting for Ukraine. Whereas the Russian media, and Boulders and Steel has written in the side chat here, what do you think about some countries banning RT, which is the Russian television channel? And YouTube have actually gone through and pretty well banned most of Russian media from YouTube now. And this has happened on Facebook and so on. But when it comes to the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, they have their own Facebook page, and it's up there.
Yeah. In fact, I'm just trying to go onto it now. The Azov Battalion Facebook page. It's quite amazing, Scott, because your channel has been removed from YouTube. I don't know if you had a Facebook page or whether that was removed. But on Facebook, for example, you're not allowed to, even doctors, medical doctors, and we've seen this, we've discussed this in the past, are not, in fact, whenever you've got a discussion on the vaccination, when you've got, for example, something that remotely challenges the vaccines that are produced by Johnson & Johnson or by some of the other vaccine companies, Pfizer, and some of the questions and disturbing aspects. What happens? Fact check comes in, this is fake news, or your post is removed. These are legitimate queries that people are having about health. And now I'm telling you, viewers, go onto Google, go into Business Insider. There's the Business Insider, the International Business Insider, there's Business Insider South Africa, and just simply type on, and you can see yourself, type in Facebook Azov Battalion. And what you will see, amazingly so, there was initially a ban on, praising neo-Nazi, far-right, fascist hate groups. Now we have a situation where Facebook is backtracking on its ban on praise for these far-right armed forces, and the posts that, in fact, are praising their role in defending Ukraine or being part of Ukraine's National Guard. Think about this. The neo-Nazi fascist paramilitary organization are part of the National Guard. And now if you praise them, this is allowed. This is totally allowed.
Well, you know what? Do you know what that demonstrates?
Allow this, but check this up on Business Insider. In fact, I want to point this out, Scott, just before I come on to you, that if you look at a 2016 report by the Organization for Human Rights, in fact, I've just got the PDF that's been basically opening now on my page. There's a report on the human rights situation in Ukraine from 16th February to 15th May 2016, just in 3 months. And you know what it says? It goes on to say that it found that Azov soldiers, the Azov battalion soldiers, had raped and tortured civilians and women and children during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, what are they there for? They're supposed to be defending Ukraine. Why are they raping the Ukrainian civilians? And these are the individuals that the United States, the Biden administration, the Obama administration, the UK military outfits support. These are the individuals that they support, the Azov battalion. But now they are basically being praised, despite the fact that they are neo-Nazi rapists
that's
at play.
Yusuf, that's why we call big tech fake media, because they basically slant everything towards. And we should also say that NATO is now the military arm of the New World Order, and this is something we haven't touched on, is that Putin is very anti the New World Order. And this is interesting because when you look at what happened before they actually went to war in Ukraine, Macron, who is the political leader in France, and Putin had several discussions. Both of them are young global leaders from the World Economic Forum. Yep, Putin actually was a young global leader too, which makes you wonder if this is not just some kind of part of the plan to take attention away from what has happened over the last 2 years, because it's all gone terribly pear-shaped. I can tell you that here in Australia, we never hear a thing now on the news about COVID. It's all about Ukraine and Russia. It's almost like it never happened. Isn't that interesting when all of a sudden, you know, the whole thing has collapsed because it's been shown to be
I think the media has the media has a major role to play in terms of influencing decision. You know, whilst you raise the issue of Macron and the meeting with Putin, I just want to point out and just leave this so that we can move on to the aspect that you raised. Meta, you know, Meta or Meta, whatever you call it. That's that's the Facebook's parent company. And in relation to the media, this is what they stated. I've got the quote there. That they state that for the time being, we are making a narrow exception for praise of the Azov regiment, strictly in the context of defending Ukraine or in their role as part of the Ukraine National Guard. But we are continuing to ban all hate speech, hate symbolism, praise of violence, generic praise, support, or representation of the Azov regiment. I mean, this is an oxymoron.
That's a
this
Facebook
is a total
quote.
Oxymoron. Does it make sense to you? I mean, and people believe this.
No, Yusuf, is that a Facebook quote? That's what they say.
That is the official Facebook quote. This is from the Business Insider. The spokesperson explained that the decision would, in fact, allow Facebook users to obtain information about the Azov Battalion's military activity, including their safety, whereabouts, and the severity of the military operations, and support can be given to it because it's in the context of defending and being part of the Ukraine National Guard. I mean, it's like saying, I mean, what's the equivocation that you could make to that? Look, you defend. There's somebody that raped 20 women on the street, but now he's basically caught a thief. He's caught a thief, so you need to praise him. What about the rape of women? I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
No, well, look,
this is the cynicism. We're living in cynical times, as we've had for the past 2 years since this COVID outbreak. It's insane.
You know what the problem is, Yusuf?
Psychopaths.
You know what the problem is? You've got geeks running the big tech companies and the media. They don't have a clue as to what, you know, or a moral compass. But let's get back to what's happening in Ukraine. Now, it was interesting that one of the first moves that Russia made was to move into the Chernobyl region, because apparently they knew they would be safe because the Ukrainian forces couldn't fire missiles into that direction because they might hit the actual power station or the power plant, which has now got like a concrete dome over it to stop the radiation leaking. And it wasn't just the east that they went in. They went in through Chernobyl, which is very close to Kiev. But they've now really basically surrounded Kiev, haven't they? I mean, they're getting very close to taking it.
Yeah, they have. Well, I mean, they haven't come and taken over Kiev, and I've seen Zelensky's. You must have seen the videos that he posted online on social media, where he speaks about standing to the death of, and defending the city itself. But apparently, the radiation levels have increased at Chernobyl after the Russian forces took. I think they basically seized the area on the 24th. And so the levels at Chernobyl's nuclear power plant have increased, and they've taken control. Apparently, there was a fierce battle. The problem is that the Chernobyl disaster. In fact, I did a discussion some years back at school on the Chernobyl disaster in the 90s. But the capture of the plant, in fact, has created some degree of fear of a radiation leak that, in fact, could cause a nuclear fallout in Europe. And that was last seen when the reactor exploded in 85 or 86. So that is obviously a concern. And what has happened is that the state regulator, the inspectorate, had stated that by Friday, there were high gamma radiation levels that were detected in that specific zone. But obviously they don't know the total details in relation to that. This is obviously a concern. It is in fact a concern. The so-called site, I mean, there was a massive disaster. That the disaster of Chernobyl in 86, and when the nuclear reactor exploded, I mean, the effects of that were experienced for decades to come.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they had this new confinement, new safe confinement, the construction of that Chernobyl confinement, which was completed, I think, in about 2018 or 2017, to obviously contain any possible explosion again. And it appears to me that, I think the shelling is essentially negligent on the part of Russia. If you are basically, and this is if the news stories are correct, but if Russia is indeed shelling a radioactive waste repository, and there is in fact an increase in radiation levels, as was initially reported in the news, the problem is that this can lead to severe and significant complications. The International Atomic Agency hasn't said too much, but it's basically calling and asking for restraint, because the nuclear facilities, if they are put at risk, then who's to say what can happen? You don't want a situation with another Chernobyl nuclear power plant basically compromised.
Can I just say that this really just puts a focus on how Coburg in the Western Cape, if you had a similar situation happen there, this could change the face of the Western Cape forever. But there's a question that's been raised in the side chat, and I just want to answer that. And that is, simply put, why did Russia invade Ukraine? And my answer to that is because Ukraine was talking about becoming a member of NATO with its US-friendly leader. And that was just a bridge too far for Putin. He said, not on my watch, and that's why he went into Ukraine, because he wants to install a leader in Ukraine who's going to be friendly to the Russians and give that buffer to keep NATO away from that extended Russian border on the west. Is there something you'd like to add to that, Yusuf?
That's correct. You're 100% correct, Scott. But it's a threat. You see, the threat that the NATO, firstly the NATO allies, the so-called peacekeeping forces, they are all amassing, and they all are basically operating, and they are there on the border. they are there on the border of Russia. And so the problem is, if you have to ask me who's to blame for this, once again, it's it's the U.S. government that has to take a significant amount of responsibility in terms of what is going on. There's an interesting website which people can get quite a lot of news from, and that's the one that's run by Professor Michel Chossudovsky. In fact, I think I'd suggested to Marlene that you get someone of the caliber of Chossudovsky, who's been an expert on this particular region for the past 20, 30 years. And the reality of the situation is that basically, by virtue of the fact that 8 years ago, US NATO installed a neo-Nazi government in Ukraine, and that government has become far more muscular in terms of its composition, in terms of the fact that, neo-Nazis generally are viewed as gangsters in Europe. If you go to Germany, and they are the lowlifes, you'd find them in the nightclubs. You find that in parts of what was then formerly East Germany, in Berlin, but they are all in the lower income areas, and you've got people that are supremacist in their particular view. Ukraine is one of the only countries in Europe where you are basically dealing with the situation that you had a transitional government, or a government that deposed the previous government, in which neo-Nazi elements actually integrate the coalition. The two main neo-Nazi entities, there was one which was called Svoboda, and the Right Sector. They were neo-Nazi outfits. They were entrusted with key positions which gave them de facto control of the armed forces, police, justice, and the national security. John McCain, by the way, like he met the ISIS members in Syria some time back, he met and he had meals with the leader of the neo-Nazi entities. Now, the Nazi Party is not popular in the United States, and if they view you as a neo-Nazi, particularly during the McCarthy era, the Nazi back then, you would be locked up in jail. And yet you find members of the so-called democracies of the world, the United Kingdom, the United States government, that meet and have met repeatedly with this. So the question we need to ask is why? Why, and what was the purpose of the US NATO installing a neo-Nazi government in Ukraine? And the answer is quite simple. It's at some point to basically install a government that is hostile to Russia. The fact that cabinet members and cabinet positions are allocated to former members of neo-Nazi fringe outfits serves only one particular purpose, and that is to be a muscular outfit that can challenge the hegemony of Russia in that particular region, and of course make it an easy access. Washington has chosen to spearhead these neo-Nazis into positions of authority, and it's a regime of indirect rule, because they take their orders on crucial military, on crucial foreign policy issues, including the deployment of troops. They take it against the Russian government. They take it from the U.S. State Department, the Pentagon, and NATO. So think about it, people out there. The United States government, the Pentagon, the NATO, the United Kingdom military are in fact actively in bed with neo-Nazi fascist military outfits. I mean, what does that tell you? It's an unheard of story. And it goes without saying that support to the formation of a neo-Nazi government does not in any way imply that the United Kingdom or the United States government are now becoming fascist. It just simply shows, as it's always showed, that the United States and the United Kingdom and most of these Western powers will jump into bed with whoever is compliant. What did they do in Africa? They jumped into bed with Al-Qaeda in Libya. They jumped in bed with them because they deposed Gaddafi. Yet in Mali, which was not too far from Libya, they were at war. They were engaged in a war of terror. So the same people that they are engaged in a war of terror in Mali, they support and back in Libya against Gaddafi. In Syria, they support ISIS. In Iraq, they're against ISIS. This is the ongoing U.S. policy that has, enveloped the world wherever and everywhere they go through.
Yusuf, I just want to add to your point there, and this needs to be understood, that the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA in the United States of America, are not a government body representing the people of the US. They are actually controlled by big business. And the CIA is literally the military arm of what we call loosely the New World Order, to go in and disrupt countries. They destroy countries because they've got a financial motivation to do so. Now, getting back to what's going on in Ukraine, Yusuf, sitting in the background, we have a neighboring territory of Russia on the eastern flank, and that is China. And you've got this Xi Jinping, who's going to be apparently the leader of China until he dies, which means he's going to be there a long, long time. He's got real ambitions to take on or take over Taiwan. Don't you think, under the circumstances where the West is basically watching what's going on in Ukraine, they're not actually participating to protect what a group that they support, don't you think China is looking at this and saying, hey, we can do this in Taiwan?
Look, it is possible that they could see this as a precedent, because it's Taiwan, and it's also the Dalai Lama in Tibet. These are kind of disputed countries.
Right.
But when I see I beg your pardon?
Yeah. So I agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. Those regions. This could be viewed. Nobody can really inaccurately predict the future pertaining to that. But for what I do see is that on Friday, Xi Jinping, that's who he is, he apparently has called upon Putin, although he's closely aligned with Vladimir Putin, but he's apparently called upon him to solve the Ukraine crisis through talks. He's talking about some form of negotiation. There was a transcript of the call where he hasn't made anything quite dramatic, but all he stated is that China supports Russia, and it supports Russia and Ukraine to resolve the issue through negotiation. So what I can see is that it stands to reason at this particular point in time, it appears that Beijing has decided to, well, on the one hand, they haven't been as open and as aggressive as the United States, as the United Kingdom, as the rest of Western Europe in calling this an invasion or condemning the Russian ally, since it's a close ally of China. So they've adopted to take a more diplomatic line, refusing to call this an invasion. In the communications that he had with Putin, apparently he told him something along the line. I don't know how these conversations happen, but he says, you need to give up the Cold War mentality. You need to attach importance to and respect the security concerns of all countries. According to the Chinese media read out, Putin obviously outlined the reasons for the Russia launching the special military operation, and apparently, the whole point being made is that the argument being made by him and Russia is that the United States and NATO have ignored Russia's security concerns,
right,
and apparently have reneged on commitments, and they've continued to advance military deployment. Because you see, when there's military deployment eastward, and you challenge Russia's strategic bottom line, what it amounts to, for example, is you challenging the sovereignty of a country. Think about it. If Botswana suddenly placed soldiers right across the border, right across its borders, overlooking South Africa, that's a threat. If China goes into Mexico and on the borders of the United States government puts all its soldiers there, or lines up or starts putting military bases, Chinese military bases there on the borders of the United States, what's going to happen? So obviously, Russia Putin's not a good man. I mean, the guy's bad news in my personal opinion. But at the same time, the fault behind what is happening at this particular juncture rests squarely, which is not being shown in the mainstream media, by the United States government, by NATO, and by these fascist paramilitary outfits that are operating in Ukraine, and this neo-Nazi government that is happening in Ukraine.
You know what's it's interesting, but it's disturbing, and it's the truth, or it's the reality of the situation in both China and Russia, is that communism has got to a stage now where it's not for the people. You've got a small group of oligarchs like Putin in Russia, who basically are the ones making all the money, and everybody else is like a slave. And the same is happening in China today. So it's an advanced form of communism, which is basically the model that the New World Order have, because what they want is to have the ultra-wealthy basically running the world, and the rest of the population just being serfs or slaves and being doing what they're told. So I say this is interesting.
Important. That's very important that you make that point, because a lot of people don't know this. I've still got something to add to it. I've still got something I need to add to it. Go ahead, Scott.
What is interesting about this situation in Ukraine is that the Secretary of State in the US said just yesterday that what Russia will achieve if they capture or take over Ukraine is they will be building with China an alternative new world order to the one that the free world want to build. In other words, they're actually admitting that what the World Economic Forum is talking about under Klaus Schwab is planned, it's underway. The Great Reset has begun through the last 2 years, what's gone on. And this guy is confirming that now the fight is between two groups of oligarchs or global leaders who want to have the world for themselves. It's got nothing to do with people or countries. It's all to do with this power thing between the free world, New World Order group, which is headed up by the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. And then on the BRICS side, like Russia and China, you've got people like Putin and Xi Jinping. I call them Xi Jinping, who are basically the oligarchs who would become the leaders of the world order in their world. So this is where it's actually going. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that is correct. Firstly, for those who don't know, Russian oligarchs, when I think about a Russian oligarch, the first man that comes to mind is Roman Abramovich. And I think maybe some of your viewers will be familiar with Roman Abramovich, those who actually follow football, the owner of Chelsea, who, by the way, I think he has to, by virtue of the fact that Russian assets have been frozen. And
he's put in the hands of someone else.
I think he's given over the holding of Chelsea to, I think he's given over I'm not so sure what has happened in relation to that, but I was reading something along the line. Russian banks have been frozen and so on, and so he's had to give up some control over Chelsea, the Chelsea Football Club. But essentially what these oligarchs are is that they were business oligarchs of the Soviet Union. Communism, we all know how communism operated. And what had happened is that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, there was a rapid accumulation of wealth during the era of Russian privatization. And, what Russian privatization is that there were, post-1990, these large-scale privatization of Russia's state-owned assets. And particularly when it came to the industrial, the energy, and the financial sector. And most of these privatization, in fact, took place during the time of Boris Yeltsin. He's the one that assumed presidency after the collapse and dissolution of the Soviet Union. Under the Soviet Union, the number of state enterprises back then was, probably about 50, 60,000. private ownership of enterprises had essentially remained illegal throughout the Soviet era because of the whole principle of communism. And this was relaxed, particularly during the latter part of the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev. There were relaxed restrictions of private property, and there was initial introductions of market reform. And at that particular point in time, there you had a situation where just when it's like they kind of knew. These people kind of knew, and that's why I say there's more than meets the eye. These were not just accidental collapses, but the actual facilitation of the transfer of a significant amount of wealth to just a small group of business oligarchs and what they call the new Russians, particularly the natural gas, the oil, the oil executives, the new Russians, as they were called. That happened just in 88, 89, leading up to 1990. Now, the point being made is that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990. But just prior to that, you had this massive accumulation of wealth. And then, of course, it obviously increased after that during the reign of Boris Yeltsin. And then, of course, you had many businessmen in Russia. They were importing smuggled goods, personal computers. They were selling them on a black market for a hefty profit. And a lot of these people suddenly, under this new privatization scheme that was being adopted by the Russian government, they then made a quick buck. And a lot of these individuals were criminals. They came from a criminal background. They were involved in the black market, and they had made a lot of money on the black market during the Soviet Union. And essentially, they became far more public by virtue of this privatization that emerged during the reign of Boris Yeltsin. And then you've got these individuals that essentially came to power. Now, people need to know that between the 2000 and 2004, there was a power struggle. Putin came into power in 2000. There was a power struggle with some of the oligarchs in terms of some sort of bargain that was being reached, because it appeared to me that after Yeltsin left, a lot of these oligarchs fell out of favor with the Putin government. So what then happened is that a number of oligarchs came under fire for illegal activities, tax evasion. But it appears to me that those that did, and those charges were politically motivated by virtue of the fact that those tycoons fell out of favor with the Kremlin. And they ended up leaving Russia in the given circumstance and state. But the reality of the situation is that those oligarchs that are today in favor of Putin are basically given free rein. A lot of these oligarchs have bought homes in upmarket sections in London. I believe there may be a few living in Australia. There may be a couple in South Africa, but they're well known. They're well known in the United Kingdom. I can
tell you that in the UK, these oligarchs own property worth $2 billion. That's just in the UK, $2 billion. Now, I've got a question here from Fiona Timms, and I promised to put this to you. And she asks, I have a very important question to put to Yusuf. Will China invade Taiwan? Russia won't condemn them, as Russia and China both have seats on the UN Security Council. China has not said anything about the invasion of Ukraine.
That's the same question that you asked earlier on. Like I stated...
but we're talking about the United Nations role here.
Well, firstly, Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine is a kind of a reminder to all of us that, how fast, how lethal, how, aggressive modern conventional warfare can be. Does a conflict, and I think the more important issue is that, does a conflict in Ukraine make one in Taiwan more likely? At this juncture, from what we can at least see, and again, there may be things happening behind the scenes which we don't know or will still come to see. There are no actual signs at this juncture that China has any plans to invade soon. There could be a plan at some particular point in time, But and whilst the war at this particular juncture, if you want to call it an invasion, could have far-reaching consequences reaching the Taiwan Strait, there's nothing that I can see that would allow for the fact that China would somehow or the other invade Taiwan. I mean, the Xi Jinping has already told Putin that, look, engage in some degree of resolution. Some argue that, however, despite the fact that there may not be a direct invasion, it could be a precursor to the Chinese Communist Party using some degree of force against Taiwan. And nobody knows what this force can be. Secondly, it's also not clear, or thirdly, it's not clear how much did the Chinese leader know about this impending attack. If he did not know about it far in advance, and if he did not do anything to militarily coincide with the invasion, then essentially it means that he is also a spectator, like many of us out there. So the reality of the situation is that it's difficult to say, and I don't have a magic ball to say whether the Russia, if you want to call it the Russia-Ukrainian war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, could be a precedent or a kind of a spearhead or a trigger for Chinese forces to assemble, similar to how Russia has assembled for the invasion of Taiwan. It's still early days for that. And there are other complications in relation to that. So I'm not in a capacity to give an answer in relation to that. I don't know how the Chinese Communist Party operate. China's planners may believe that an assault on Taiwan could be risky, you see?
Yeah.
And why would they want to go and... Because at this particular point in time, if they're invading Taiwan, and bearing in mind that they've got the US, they've got US-ish, warships that are not too far away from... They're not on Chinese territorial ground, but they or the sea, but they are nearby, and I mean they've got that to concern themselves of. So the fact is that they've got threats on multiple sides and they've got multiple players. So if there is a kind of an invasion timetable, and if an invasion timetable of Taiwan does exist, then it could be kind of postponed for some years to come. And so China may not be in a position to invade Taiwan today, maybe not in the next couple of weeks, but in the next couple of years, that is likely, it could happen. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. And what China could do is that they could learn as many lessons as possible about the Russia-Ukrainian war. Certainly, if everything goes well for Russia at this particular point in time and Russian forces far outnumber that of the Ukraine, then what it would do, it would embolden this character Xi Jinping. It would embolden him, and certainly it could solidify plans to invade the island. But if everything goes bad for Putin, and he's already facing a number of reverses in the last 24 hours, and of course the sanctions and the economic sanctions. By the way, economic sanctions don't work, and they're not going to work in any event. But if there are reversals made in terms of the invasion by Russia, then certainly China could be persuaded that attacking Taiwan could prove to be risky, at the very least in the long term.
Yeah.
And I think these are the factors we need to play.
I just want to say that when it comes to Taiwan, this, I think, is far more dangerous than Ukraine. I think Ukraine has always been, disposable for the West. So I think they're happy for Russia to take that because it used to be Russian. But I think Taiwan is a different kettle of fish. And the thing that worries me about Taiwan is that the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has said that if China goes into Taiwan, Australia will go in and defend Taiwan. Now, what that does is it puts us in the front line of an attack by China. And I live in Brisbane. We're the northernmost, closest city to China. And these guys have got some serious hardware. I mean, missiles that could hit any part of Australia. I could be living in a place called Yangtze this time next year. I mean, seriously, that could be the situation, because I don't think America would step in if China responded and tried to take Australia. And Australia is piss weak when you compare it to what China's got.
Yeah, that is true. I think we should also there's a 5,000 word document. I must access it online between Xi Jinping and Putin. And apparently what this document stated is that there's both parties are signatories to pledging endless friendships and no limits to cooperation. Now, despite the fact that Xi Jinping has spoken out and has suggested that, look, Putin, go to the drawing board and engage in some degree of cooperation, he's essentially allowed Putin to go ahead with the invasion. He hasn't taken the stance, as a lot of the Western military governments have done, and has supported some of the key aspects of this. So ultimately, at some point, by virtue of the support, just like the mafia expects something in return, Xi Jinping is going to demand that Putin at some point in time support the Chinese Communist Party's claim on Taiwan.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, this would be an opportunity to, in fact, it wouldn't have been done before, but it would be an opportunity to segment and cement his legacy, which is unification, and incorporating China by forceful means with the mainland. But be that as it may, I have problems, and that could possibly happen, and we don't know what the implications in relation to that is. China is bad news, by the way. China is not good news. They certainly keep the United States in check, and as Russia and many of these other countries do, but China is bad news. The Chinese Communist Party, in fact, the blueprint for its global lockdown was borrowed by the World Health Organization and imposed throughout all of us. We experienced, when we first saw in December 2019, the Chinese strictures and lockdown on its own population. What we saw around the world, where did it come from? The fascist blueprint for global control was certainly set up by the elitists in China, whoever's controlling China, and that fascist blueprint for control was simply imported in different countries.
Well, it was
so anything could happen.
It was actually spelt out in a document by the Rockefeller Foundation in 2010.
In 2010, yes.
Yeah.
That is correct.
Look, I'm going to wrap up this live stream shortly, because I think we've pretty well covered the subject comprehensively. I just want to, before we do wrap it up, ask you, Yusuf, is there anything further you'd like to add to what we've said? Perhaps just your predictions as to what's going to happen, let's say a year from now, what will be happening in Ukraine?
Well, like I said earlier on, Scott, is that most of us, we see the situation, and then we see what other people write, and we obviously then provide some degree of analysis in terms of what the future will hold. What is quite clear is that we are now living. We're no longer living in what they call what's a word? A unipolar world. We clearly are living in a bipolar world, and by invading Ukraine, or by entering Ukraine, I would argue that at some level there is certainly reasons, and there's a rationale in terms of why Putin has been entering Ukraine and why he's annexed to that. But at some level, he also steals the future from his own people, because this is a kind of a watershed moment for Europe. For the first time since the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, they were limited to the area of disintegrating the whole region of Yugoslavia. The European continent, Europe, is once again confronted with bombardment of cities and these rolling tanks. But this time, I don't think it's happened before. You've got a nuclear superpower that has started the fighting, which is Russia. So the thing is, as much as Ukraine is ruled by a neo-Nazi fascist regime, Putin, on the other hand, is also laying the grounds for other countries to possibly show, and people are talking about China and what it could probably do in Taiwan, but it's laying the ground for other countries to, at the very least, potentially show a degree of brazen disregard for international treaties and the law of nations. According to what I can understand, according to Putin's declarations, Ukraine has no right to exist as a sovereign state, even though it's a member of the United Nations, even though it's a member of the Council of Europe, and even though Russia itself, they were one of the first countries after the breakdown of the Soviet Union to recognize Ukraine's independence. So the thing, Scott, is this: is that you've got to catch you into a situation. Yes, you've got a neo-Nazi, evil, fascist regime in control of Ukraine. What do you do about that? And then on the other hand, you've got Putin, who is now saying, well, look, Ukraine is actually an inseparable part of Russia. So for me, I would argue, and as I've always argued in most of these conflicts, we look at what is the will. What do the Ukrainians want? If, for example, the majority of Ukrainians want to be part and parcel of Russia, then the Ukrainian government has got no right to impose its will upon them. Then the Ukrainians have to obviously be incorporated into the Russian Federation. If, as I've pointed out, Kashmir, for example, doesn't want to be part of, the people of Kashmir don't want to be part of India, then the Indian government's got no right to exercise its control, oppression, and get soldiers out there to rape Kashmiri women. If governments want to, if individuals and people want to be independent, if Scotland, for example, wants to be independent, doesn't want to be part of the United Kingdom, and the majority of Scots want to be excluded, like the Republic of Ireland, they don't want to be part of the United Kingdom, you need to respect the will of the Scottish people. You need to accept the will of the people. And that, for me, at the end of the day, is that these wars, Putin wants more than Ukraine. He wants Ukraine. At the same time, the US and NATO want Ukraine. They are the fascist paramilitary outfits that exist there. What's their role? Their role are just simply foot soldiers. These neo-Nazis are the foot soldiers of the United States government. So the United States wants that region. Russia wants that region itself. So therefore, this is basically a war about the European system, which in itself is fundamentally and utterly corrupt and rotten to the core, and which in fact rests on the idea of borders, the inviolability of borders, the idea of seeking to redraw the map by force. What Putin is doing is that he wants to redraw the map by force. What the US and NATO are doing is that in a more clandestine fashion, in a more sinister fashion, they are using foot soldiers to take over and control regions. And the US has been more successful than Russia in doing this. The US has been successful. Why? Because when they destroy a country, they don't say, look, we are coming and taking over the country. What they do is that they place compliant leaders that are the puppets of the United States government and that are viewed as compliant tools, and there's an apparent independence that is taking place. What Russia, on the other hand, and Putin is doing is that he's doing something which is far more aggressive and far more open to say that, look, we're not going to put a compliant Russian system, pro-Russian government in place. We want to take over this. We want to annex Donetsk and Luhansk and incorporate it as part of the Russian Federation. So, set against these kind of historical facts, we can see that both parties basically are using the Ukrainian population for their own gains. If you're talking about the idea of territorial integrity, I believe every country has a right to territorial integrity. There was the document that was signed at Budapest in '94, and that was on the basis that you shouldn't be able to destroy the territorial integrity of a country just for the sake of it. The reality of the situation is that nobody follows that. The United States is a hypocrite. The United Kingdom and Western countries are total hypocrites because they've been guilty on far more worse crimes than the Russian government has ever done. The Russia has never invaded any country. I mean, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Chechnya, all these other countries were all part and parcel of the United Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR. They were all part of it. And they obviously gained their independence at a subsequent level. But they never invaded foreign countries. I don't think Putin's got the aim of invading France or invading Germany or anything along that line. But the United States, on the other hand, does, and it has in the past, and has got a history. So the criticism by the Biden administration is a sign of cynical hypocrisy of the highest order.
Yeah.
And they should be condemned, and they should take responsibility, which nowhere, and I'm glad your channel does this for the first time, and let this go out there, that the main cause of what we see right now in terms of the Russian forces invading Ukraine are as a result of the US-NATO alliance, which is bordering Russia, which is increasing the military might against Russia, and of course this neo-Nazi regime that is in occupation in Ukraine. Right. At the end of the day, the Ukrainian people die. They suffer.
Yeah.
They are suffering because they are caught up in this web of control by two superpowers that want to exercise their force and control of the region. Right. That's the end game.
Yeah. Look, I just want to say, just in wrapping this live stream up, that clearly, if you look at the children of these very powerful political leaders in the US who have become directors of energy companies in Ukraine, they have absolutely no knowledge of energy or the businesses that they're directors in. Clearly, deals have been made, and this is where the US interest is. It's nothing to do with the Ukrainian people. It's all about the deep state, the big swamp. That's what's actually happening, and we're actually seeing it happen live in Ukraine today. And I have to say that a lot of people are basically having a go at Putin for doing what he's doing, and I'm sort of like sitting on the fence with this one, because I don't like Putin at all. I don't like Russia at all, but at least he is standing up to the bullies, and the bullies are the New World Order, and they're the ones who are going to be coming after us as well, and we need to realize that. Now, Yusuf, yeah. I just want to thank you so much for coming on tonight to share your expertise on the subject with us. We look forward to having you again in the future. There's lots of things happening in the world, and it's always good to get your perspective. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's always a pleasure to speak to you, Scott. I always appreciate the opportunity that your channel gives me and many others to get this alternative information out there, because this is certainly something that we're not seeing in the mainstream media, and it's been curtailed, as you can clearly see, over the past 2 years since the COVID scan. And so I appreciate that once again.
Alrighty, fantastic. Take care, Yusuf.
You take care too, Scotty. All the best.
Cheers.
Bye for
All right, guys, that was Yusuf Ismail, who's a regular on Lovey Life TV, and he's oh, my camera seems to have frozen. I'm not sure why, but as long as you can still hear me, that's fine. I'm going to wrap this live stream up. I will go out with Hier Blij Ek Boer, and have a great evening. And thank you to the moderators for the great job you do in the side chat. I see we had a couple of trolls earlier on, and it's always good to see how quickly you guys respond. I mean, it's like the Wild West, you know. You got your hand on the trigger. As soon as the troll comes up, it's bang, it's gone. I love it. All right, guys, here comes Hier Blij Ek Boer. I'm just waiting for my computer to wake up. Oh my gosh, here we go. Okay, let's see if this will work. Sorry guys, my computer's just having a little bit of a freeze here at the moment. Okay, I think we're getting closer. It's working on it. And you love it when you get a big white page when you go into a folder and it says at the top, working on it. Oh my gosh, this is a real... Okay, here we go. Hier bly ek boer. Working on it. Here we go.
Meer as 61,000 van ons voorvaders het op die grens vir ons gesterwe, sodat ons vry kan wees. Die is my land, die is my reg, hier is die boer. Van stof is ek gemaak en sal ek terugkeer. Die Bybel is die woord waaruit ek leer, soos die grond op die aarde. Hier bly ek boer. Soos 'n diep in die nag sal die vyand kom, maar hier bly ek staan en ek draai nie om, want jy maak my nie bang nie. Hier bly ek boer. In die somer wat vreugde bring, my oupa wat maniekie roe kon sing, soos hy stap deur die lande, hier was hy boer. My wortels lê diep in die grond geplant, hy sien soos my pa los ek vir jou die land, en jy hoef nie te vrees nie, hier sal jy boer. Die is my land waarvoor ek sal veg, die is my bloed, my sweet, my reg, die is die plek waar my voorvaders leef, die is my land waar ek jou sê. Sal kom, die leeu sal kom, die leeu sal kom, die leeu sal kom, die leeu Salcom.